229.
Turned to the wrong number. What is he? I did finally catch up to you.
230. Shall I empty-handed be?
Assume that last song was somewhat asking a hypothetical, because an evidence of your salvation is fruit. Well, fruit And if there's a total absence of any of that, then the conclusion would be what?
Maybe you are one of God's children.
And so,
Good works prepared in advance and laid out for you. I love that.
yeah. So yeah, I might be a little bit on the edge of.
We'll say a rhetorical question.
Okay, rhetorical. I like that. All right, Isaiah, chapter 38. So Cindy, what'd you think of the escape room? I was going to ask you yesterday.
I had fun.
Okay.
We didn't solve all of the puzzles before the hour was up, and I'm not sure how much I actually contributed, but it helped having more people there. If there was only 2 or 3, that would have been pretty hard to, let you be in more than one place at the same time. And I like to think I contributed at least a little bit. And it seemed like all of us had a good time. I know Billy said, that was really fun.
Good.
We should do this again. And I thought, yeah, we should.
Was the Sesame Street count one of the answers?
That was not one of the answers.
I was hoping that would be helpful.
Too bad, because I've seen that program before.
All right, so we are in Isaiah chapter 38. We started this last week. Isaiah chapter 38, and interesting chapter, of course. This is when Hezekiah was told by the Lord via Isaiah that he was going to die, and so he was given the opportunity that a lot of us won't have, and that's to prepare, to know that you're going to, I mean, I guess we all know that, but
we should put our house in order right now.
we should, but we don't, because we're busy living, I guess. So he was given that opportunity, and I loved his response, because his immediate response upon hearing that, I mean, I don't know, what would your immediate response be? Okay, you can get real hyper spiritual if you want, but
No, I
what?
cry and whine and feel sorry for myself.
or maybe I want my family here, or I mean, I don't know. There'd be a lot of instinctive responses. But his response was to immediately pray. Right then and there, in the presence of all the people, how many people there were doesn't give us the context there, but he turned away from them, turned to face the wall, and he started to pray. And we saw the same thing when Sennacherib, was threatening, and they're waiting there on Nob Hill, getting ready to lay siege to Jerusalem, and Hezekiah's immediate response was to take that threatening letter and lay it before the Lord. Not because the Lord hadn't read it already, but because he was symbolically saying, God, you've got to handle this. And that ought to be our instinctive response. And maybe instinctive is the wrong word. Maybe our disciplined response, the result of building a habit, so that when the little things go wrong, that we think we can take care of ourselves, maybe we ought to discipline ourselves and turn to the Lord first. What's my best way to handle this? And very likely God's answer is going to be, take care of it, do it, but build that discipline in the little things and see how God provides, so that then when we get the big things like you're going to die, get your house in order, our response is immediately, God, I'm bringing this before you. And so he prayed, and verse 4, he wept sore. Remember, this is taking place in an Old Testament economy, an Old Testament context. And so he brought out the fact that he had walked before God in truth. He had walked with a perfect heart, not saying that he was perfect, but that he had, done his best to walk righteously. Because under the law, that's what you did. And so he said, but God, I have done those things. And then verse 4, then came the word of the Lord to Isaiah, saying, go and say to Hezekiah, thus saith the Lord, the God of David thy father, I have heard thy prayer, I have seen thy tears, behold, I will add unto thy days 15 years. And so what a reprieve, although I'm sure those 15 years went fast. But what a reprieve. And remember, the answer came, we looked in 2 Kings, came, before Isaiah could even leave the building, and so God heard and he responded. And then he gave the sign, and we spent some time last week talking about that. The sign that the sundial of Ahaz, and probably that was a spiral staircase that as the sun would progress, the shadow on the spiral would indicate the time of day. What did it do?
It moved backward. The shadow moved backward.
Yeah, 10 degrees it moved backwards. And so we talked about, well, how could that even happen? Physics is against that.
God's in charge.
Exactly. God's the one who established physics. God's the one who spoke this world into being. God established the natural laws, and if he wants to reverse them, he can. And we talked about some of the ways that people have tried to explain it away, that it was an eclipse that conveniently happened. And could God have used an eclipse? Absolutely. But we don't have to limit him to that. We don't have to, that's like, I remember sharing with you, several years ago, I'd come across a research paper by two theological students who, I don't know, I think a requirement to be a theology major is you ought to have a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ. That's just my personal opinion, because they were trying to explain away all the miracles, and when Jesus walked on the water, do you remember the Sea of Galilee had an extremely unusual event of freezing? I don't know. It might be easier to, by faith, believe that the God who created the Sea of Galilee, allowed Jesus to walk on it. But so again, we looked at some of the different ways that people have tried to explain it away. We don't have to. We just have to accept it. God did it. He said he would, and he did it. And if for Joshua he could keep the sun from setting until the battle was completed, he certainly could move the shadow back 10 degrees.
I found it interesting that it wasn't. Sometimes God says, "What sign shall I show? What sign do you want so that you'll know it's really me?" And they've picked some rather odd ones, like the dew on the fleece. But this wasn't Hezekiah saying, "Oh Lord, if you really mean it, turn the shadow back 10 degrees." Nobody was asking him. God just said, "Here's how you'll know.
Now,
I'm turning the shadow back 10 degrees, and when you see that, you'll say, oh, this was God, in fact."
in terms of the specifics, you're exactly right. So this wasn't like Gideon.
Right.
Make it dry when everything else is wet, make it wet when everything else is dry. This wasn't like that. But we actually do find at the end of this chapter, out of chronological order, surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
If you go back to 2 Kings 20, you can find it in order. But Hezekiah did say, "What is the sign that I shall go up to the temple of the Lord in 3 days?" So there was a request for the sign, but not a specification. And remember the contrast between this and Ahaz, that Isaiah told Ahaz, ask the Lord for a sign, ask the Lord for wisdom, ask the Lord, and Ahaz.
Oh, no, I don't want to bother him. I've got this controlled.
Yeah. I got it covered. Yeah, exactly. And so again, you have that difference between the two. What was one possibility of why? I mean, if God came to any one of us and said, "You're going to die, prepare yourself," we would certainly go through, I'm sure, a number of emotions. But Hezekiah wept sore. Last week, I told you that he was a young man in the prime of his life. And I said we could probably figure out about how old he was. Well, somebody else did the work for me. I didn't have to do it. He was probably in his 30s at this point, maybe 30 to 40, somewhere in there. And so he did make some statements about. I guess we haven't gotten there yet, but we will get there tonight about being I'm deprived of the residue of my years and so on. Where was I going with this? why was it that he wept sore? What was one of the possibilities of why this was just a devastating blow to him? Cindy, you came up with one possibility, remembering the context of when all this is taking place. And then we turned to Josephus and came up with another possibility.
Well, one possibility is that he's leaving his people, he's leaving a job undone. He wants to protect his people from the Assyrians, which is a very real threat.
But wait a moment, it was just last chapter that the Assyrians were destroyed.
Yeah, this isn't in chronological order.
No,
Surprise, surprise.
Isaiah does not follow
Yeah, he's not big on chronological order. So he wanted to see his people, I think, through this crisis. So I was just thinking to myself, if God told me, Cindy, you're going to die tomorrow, I think, oh, but wait, I haven't. I've got unfinished projects. It's going to take me more than a day to get my house in order.
Yeah, and
so
absolutely.
that was what I thought of, and that might have been a factor there. But I think Josephus's reason was more.
And that was?
He had no children at this time.
Yeah, he didn't have an heir. He didn't have a son to take the throne.
Wouldn't it also show bad on his character if he died young?
That makes it,
Like you were saying.
because of the Old Testament
Yeah, people were
context.
blessed if they.
Long life. Yeah, and we'll get a little more into that, but yeah, I think that definitely would be a factor. You know, what's my legacy here? You know, how
What will people think?
Of course, we also discussed the fact that, you know, who was the son that he then left the kingdom to?
He was really rotten. Was
Yeah.
it Manasseh?
Manasseh, yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, sometimes we get what we want, but it's not what we really wanted. But anyway, so that's where we left it last week. We actually left it on a little bit of a positive note. Let's see, verse. We talked about. I guess we didn't end on this, but we talked about the fact that Isaiah was told to say to Hezekiah in verse 5, "Thus saith the Lord, the God of David thy father, I have heard thy prayer." And we talked about why it was so important that God stressed that through Isaiah, that it was the God of David, because of the Davidic covenant and of his throne. And if one of his concerns was both the state of the nation, with Assyria about ready to attack, and the fact that he didn't have an heir to the throne, then the reminder that God had covenanted with David with the promise of his descendants on the throne and so on would actually be an encouraging thing. So that's where we ended last week, having looked at the evidence that God gave him. The sundial is going to go back 10 degrees. And then verse 9 is the writing of Hezekiah, king of Judah, when he had been sick and was recovered from his sickness. And it goes through this whole segment about discouragement and depression. You're thinking, well, how does that fit in with he was just recovered from his sickness? But again, this isn't a chronological thing, or I guess it is chronological, because it's Hezekiah writing down what happened, both before and after God had given him, had spared his life. And so it starts out with the moment that he learned that God said, "You're going to die, you're not going to live, set your house in order." And so let's take a look there, verse 10. "I said in the cutting off of my days, I shall go to the gates of the grave. I am deprived of the residue of my years." And so again, a young man in his 30s, maybe 40, somewhere in there, and by all rights would have expected to live certainly longer than that. I mean, if he was 40, he would only live to be 55, but nonetheless, certainly would have expected to live longer than that. And he gets the news: your life's going to be short. And so what happens? Well, verse 11, "I said, I shall not see the Lord, even the Lord." And it's a repeated word in the Hebrew, just Lord, Lord. "I shall not see the Lord, Lord." The translators, as a matter of fact, the word "even" is in what?
Italicized.
Yeah, it's italicized. It was added by the translator. So, I shall not see the Lord, Lord. And you look at that and you say, man, did he have some issues with eschatology and resurrection and, well, let's read the context. I shall not see the Lord where?
In this way.
In the land of the living. So his relationship with God was important to him. It's going to come to an end, that stage of it. And he says, I shall behold man no more with the inhabitants of the world. So I'm leaving those that I love. I'm going to leave the relationship with God that I love. And what would that have involved? I mean, that would have involved the temple. That would have involved the sacrifices. All of it. I'm going to leave that. I'm not going to be able to do that anymore. And so this is how he was impacted when he first found out. Verse 12, mine age is departed and is removed from me as a shepherd's tent. I have cut off like a weaver my life. So a shepherd's tent, of course, shepherds were nomadic, and so they could pick up and move at an instant's notice. And we actually touched on this a little bit last week, because just the shepherd, not a nomadic family or a nomadic tribe, could pick up and leave even easier. And we talked about the boys on their trip out west, and setting up the tent and tearing it down, and setting up the tent and tearing it down. And just like that, your tent was there one day, the next day it's gone. And that's what Isaiah is saying about his life. You want to know something? That's true whether you live to be 35 or you live to be 105. Life is but a vapor. It's here one moment, it's gone the next. I mean, life is short. And, for those of us that are getting older each year, oh yeah, that would be all of us. But those of us who are past that midpoint of expected life, we're on the downhill slide. It's accelerating. Life is short. And for Hezekiah, it was even shorter. And he said, so I feel like a shepherd's tent. It's there one day, you go back the next day, it's gone. I have cut off like a weaver in my life. So, Cindy, I was going to depend on you for this. So I'm picturing a weaver's loom. And you're feeding in the different threads, and if a thread runs out, you tie on another one. You just keep feeding it until you reach the length of it. And at some point, it's not that you've run out of threads, but you do what?
Cut it off.
Yeah.
You're done.
Just like that. So one moment, you see all those threads waiting to be woven into to the rest of your rug or whatever it is, and the next moment, it's cut off. That's what Hezekiah is comparing this to. And I really think it doesn't matter your age. It doesn't matter whether you're 18 like Matthew or, Joan, are you 95?
I'll be 96 in a couple months.
So 96, it doesn't matter. Life suddenly, it comes quick. And we don't know when that's going to be. Okay, Hezekiah did know. And so he's making his comparisons. He says, he will cut me off with pining sickness from day even to night, wilt thou make an end of me. So from you wake up in the morning happy, healthy, and you find out, oh, no, you're going to die. Life is short. Verse 13, I reckon till morning that as a lion, so will he break all my bones. From day even to night wilt thou make an end of me. That's not a pretty picture. You think of Daniel when he was thrown into the lion's den. Remember what the lions did? Even just, they opened the pit, and I guess this wasn't Daniel. This was when they threw the advisors who had plotted against him. But they caught them before they even hit the ground and tore them to pieces. Finding out, going to the doctor today and the doctor says, hey, there's nothing we can do. You've got less than 24 hours to live. I think it would feel a lot like that. You never had a chance to hit ground. And so plans in the morning, and by the end of the day, those plans are meaningless. You're not going to be around for them. So that's what he felt. in verse 1. That's what he's describing. What was his response? Well, we saw it in verse 2, but we also see it in verse 14 in a much more picturesque fashion. Like a crane or a swallow, so did I chatter. So I'm just picturing these birds are cheep, 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 usually at 5:30 in the morning when you're trying to sleep in until, okay, I know, Tom, that doesn't apply to you, but just that constant chirping and twittering back and forth and all of this. So I did chatter. I did mourn as a dove, and maybe continual cooing sound or whatever it might be. What's he talking about? Well, let's look at the next phrase. My eyes fail with looking upward. Notice again, with looking is what? In italics. What did you say, Joan?
I said, he's praying.
Exactly. He says, my eyes fail upward. I'm chattering like a bird saying, Lord, can you give me more time? Lord, can you let me finish out my responsibilities? Lord, can you, and that's a picture of intense prayer. Oh Lord, I am oppressed, and then I love this next part. Undertake for me. There comes a point with disease that there's nothing more you can do. On a very positive note, Bethany went to visit Kay today, and she says she's doing so well. Her skin tone is good of her leg and so on.
Who is this?
Kay, Jerry's sister.
Oh.
Yeah, Bethany visited with her today, and she's just doing really well. But there comes a time when medicine doctors say, there's nothing we can do. We're going to give you as much comfort as we can. We'll try and remove the pain and do whatever we can, but there's nothing more we can do. Hezekiah says, I am oppressed. Lord, you undertake for me. I give it to you. Again, what I loved was that was his first response. He didn't run around to all the court physicians. Do you think he had his own personal court physicians?
He was the king, of course
yeah.
he did.
He didn't run around getting second opinions. He didn't bring in the specialists. Well, he did bring in the specialists. He turned to the Lord. And then verse 15. What shall I say? He hath both spoken unto me, and himself hath done it. I shall go softly all my years in the bitterness of my soul. O Lord, by these things men live, and in all these things is the life of my spirit. So wilt thou recover me and make me to live. He says, God, it's in your hands. To the grave, in the bitterness of my soul, because again, he's disappointed. He's got these burdens that he wants. I'll go quietly. But Lord, you can make me live. You can recover me. You can make me to live. And so he had a confidence here that God could answer his prayers. And then, Doug, I think this might be a little bit of what you were talking about. Verse 17, behold, for peace I had great bitterness, but thou hast in love to my soul delivered it from the pit of corruption, for thou hast cast all my sins behind thy back. Again, he saw a correlation between his early death and sin. Now, he had pleaded his case, Lord, I had a perfect heart, I lived righteously before you. But he still saw that correlation, and again, there would be a stigma attached to that. We understand the stigma of sin a little bit, but our culture is doing its best to wipe that out, and to applaud sin and honor it instead of. But there would have been that because that's where he made the connection. And again, why? Well, because he's not in the New Testament. He's not living in the age of grace. He's living under the law. And there was connections, direct connection between long life, prosperous life, healthy life, and godly living. Now, there's still those connections because God's principles still work. But we're not tied to it in the same way that the Old Testament saints were. And then verse 18, when I first read it, I struggled a little bit again. Was this just an incomplete understanding of the resurrection? And yeah, I think it probably was. I mean, like I said last week, we also have an incomplete understanding of the resurrection. God has revealed a lot more to us, but we don't understand it. But let's take a look. For the grave cannot praise thee, death cannot celebrate thee, they that go down into the pit cannot hope for thy truth. The living, he shall praise thee, as I do this day. I think that was part of it. If I die now, then I can't continue to praise you. If I die now, people might talk about, so what did Hezekiah do wrong that he died young? Kind of like Job's comforters. What happens to the testimony of God? But the living, he shall praise thee. In verse 19 it says, oh, okay. Thank you.
Not hear you.
Thank you, Matthew. And so he says, as I do this day, the father to the children shall make known thy truth. And there's that generational thing. That's what I talk about all the time, passing on our spiritual heritage. Hezekiah didn't have anyone to pass it on to until later. And so what does he say? Verse 20, the Lord was ready to save me. Therefore, we will sing my songs to the stringed instruments all the days of our life in the house of the Lord. I think this was a big factor. Now, yes, the Assyrians were outside the walls. That's a pretty big factor. He's dying childless, according to Josephus. And again, that's extra biblical. You can see some verses like the one about passing on generationally. You can see some verses that could support that. I don't know for sure, but it seems logical. And yet he spends a lot of time concerned about how the name of God, how the testimony of God is affected by this. He wants to praise him. You know what that tells me? That tells me he was already praising him. And so he wants a chance to keep praising because he knows if he goes to the grave, that opportunity ends. You can't praise God among the living after you die. Now your testimony can live on, your heritage and so on, and the choices you made in this life can reflect well on God, but you no longer have a chance to do that. And so he wants to be able to sing songs of praise to God. And then we have verses 21 and 22, which just kind of seems oddly placed here. And if we go back to 2 Kings 20, it's a more chronological pattern. But remember, he's reflecting back on what had happened. And he says, for Isaiah had said, let them take a lump of figs and lay it for a plaster. I assume that's plaster, the old English spelling, but I could be wrong. Upon the boil, and he shall recover. I don't know the medicinal value of a lump of figs. I'm going to lean towards this was a miraculous healing, and the lump of figs was an action that God gave him to do in faith. Wash in the river. How does that heal leprosy?
And probably more active cause you to catch something else worse.
Spit and mud. How does it? It's a physical action of belief, but a miracle that took place. And verse 22, Hezekiah also had said, what is the sign that I shall go up to the house of the Lord? Well, what was the sign? The sundial would go back 10 degrees. That's chapter 38. I told you when we first started into this section that there were 3 events that happened. 2 of them, Hezekiah did well. Well, we've had those 2. The first one was the Assyrians. Okay, chronologically, it's not the first one, but where Hezekiah's response. Now, he had prepared. You know, he had done all sorts of preparations in having a water source and all of these different things. He had prepared. But when push came to shove, his first response was, Lord, here's the threatening letter. What would you have us to do? When Isaiah told him, you're going to die, get your house in order. His first response, to turn away to the wall and to pray before God, undistracted by those around him. And so 2 times he responded in faith, and God answered. We come to chapter 39, and chronologically, the context is important here. So the Assyrians are outside the door. And so who is the dominant power right now? Assyria. Okay, they've got Egypt on the run. Okay, they're a little concerned of Egypt. They don't want the Egyptians to join in with the Jews, but they're not scared that the Egyptians are going to win. It just would slow things down. So they're the dominant power. So chapter 39 says, at that time Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon. Wait, Babylon? Isn't that just that little city? I mean, maybe it's got a wall, but I'm pointing the wrong direction. Yes, this city over here, it's just a little place, and so yeah, now it definitely is, unless you're a coyote or something. But anyway, the king of Babylon sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he heard that he had been sick and was recovered. Oh, that was nice. What's the, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Maybe sometimes you should. So he gets a gift from the king of Babylon. Verse 2, and Hezekiah was glad of them. Why? Is it, oh, that's so thoughtful.
I think this was like real, he wanted to impress them.
Okay, that's what's definitely going to happen, but why?
Well,